Hi everyone, my name is Bill Curtis, and today I want to talk about the evolution of the e-commerce extension. How were e-commerce extensions built 5 years ago? How are they being built today? And what assumptions can we make about the future? So before we get started, just a bit about myself. I'm probably best known in the Magento community for being the CTO at SweetTooth. At SweetTooth, we help merchants retain their customers by building points and reward systems for their stores. We started off about 6 years ago as a tiny Magento extension, and today we power it with loyalty programs for over 10,000 merchants on a handful of different platforms. You can also find me on Twitter and on GitHub if you want to tweet at me or follow some of the work I'm doing with Magento 2 and webhooks. I'm also very proud to be Canadian, but I have to be honest with you guys. I wish I could stay here longer in Spain because, to be honest, I'm not looking forward to going home. Where I come from, winter is actually coming. And sometimes it gets a little crazy. Oh, wow. Okay, back to Magento e-commerce extensions. So let's jump back to 2009. The first version of SweetTooth was just released on Magento version 1.2. And it turns out this was a really good time to release an extension because it was just before Magento really started to take off. So we noticed that the community started building. More merchants, more e-commerce agencies, more extension developers started getting involved. The community started to grow, which meant we were seeing SweetTooth being used on more and more shops. Magento Connect came out, which is another channel for us to connect merchants and extension developers to create better e-commerce experiences. So this also drove more installs. But it didn't take long before we realized something very important. And that is that maintaining Magento extensions is hard. And the reason it's hard is because the second someone downloads your extension, it's out of your control. They can run it on any version of Magento, along with any number of extensions that might do some crazy core rewrites or something like this, or customize your extension. And this results in support costs that start going up with every new install. Because support inquiries aren't necessarily bugs in the code, but they're problems with the environment in which the code is running. So in hindsight, it's not that maintaining Magento extensions is hard, it's that maintaining deployed software in general is very hard. So deployed software has a few different connotations, but for this talk, I'd like to define it as software that runs in an environment that is uncontrolled by the vendor. So Magento extensions are a great example of this. Here's SweetTooth running on a Magento. So we have a copy of the extension, and it's running on merchant servers, which we don't control. So if another merchant installs SweetTooth, now we have two different copies of our extension, which could be one of two versions, one of many versions, and we have two different environments in which our software is run. So as time goes on, this pattern continues, and it causes three major pain points that I'm sure every extension developer has experienced. Slow update adoption, environment fragmentation, and integrations that just don't scale. So let's talk about slow update adoption. I think we can all agree on one fact, and that is that updating Magento extensions, especially in a production environment, is not that easy. It's very involved, and it's very highly intensive on the merchant's behalf, and not necessarily the developers. So the developer can cut a release, test it on Magento versions, sure. But it's up to the merchant and their team to, first of all, know that there's an update to the extension, then download it, run it locally, test it, commit it to source control, throw it up on staging, test it with any other changes that might be going out to production, and then finally get it into production and hope that this version of the extension didn't break something that they weren't able to test. So the end result is, in general, merchants just don't update their extensions if it's not necessary. And this leads to our second big problem, which is environment fragmentation. This is a really cool histogram you might have seen floating around Twitter last month, put out by a Dutch company called Byte.nl. Shout out to them. On the y-axis, we have every single version of Magento Community Edition in the blue, and every version of Magento Enterprise in the red. And on the x-axis, it shows the distribution of Magento merchants currently live that are running each different version. So there's a huge variety of versions of Magento that your extension might run on, And that means whenever you cut a new release as an extension developer, you need to test on every single one of those versions that you want to support. But environment fragmentation doesn't stop there. It's really a combination of the Magento environment and any custom tweaks that the merchant has made, a combination of any handful of extensions that are also installed that might conflict with your software, and your specific extension that's being run. So if we take all these different variables into account, we end up with thousands, if not tens of thousands of possible environments in which our software will be run. And basically what this boils down to is higher support costs. It's harder to help merchants when you can't reproduce the bugs on your side. So with Sweet Tooth, we test on every version of Magento we support that's bare, but it's generally the support inquiries we get are more to do with the environment that our software is running on than an actual logic error in the extension. And the third big problem is integrations that don't scale. So at Sweet Tooth, we get two very common types of emails. The first is merchants who aren't on Magento, who want to run Sweet Tooth. So they're running WooCommerce or a handful of others. So how might this look with our extension if we were to kind of port it to these other platforms? Here we have WooCommerce and PrestaShop. The big problem is that 100% of our business logic, the way Sweet Tooth operates, is contained within the Magento extension, which means that if we're going to port it to a WooCommerce or another deployed platform, we're literally going to have to copy our entire app and learn the intricacies of each of these other e-commerce platforms. So we're spreading our dev team thin to begin with. But that's not where it stops. Also, every time we release a new feature now for Sweet Tooth, we have to build it 3 different times with 3 different technologies. It slows development down, and we can't update Sweet Tooth and add new features fast enough. Oh, and by the way, we've basically tripled our support costs because each of these platforms suffer from fragmentation and slow extension updates as well. The second very common type of email we get is, does Sweet Tooth integrate with this other application I'm running? For example, MailChimp, or a handful of others. So let's see how that might work. Let's use MailChimp as an example. And there's two use cases the merchants usually want. The first is, hey, we want to segment our customers based on their points balance, and we can send them a custom email. Okay, so how are we going to do that from our Sweet Tooth Magento extension? How do we push these points balances up to MailChimp? The good news is MailChimp has a really slick API where you can actually add custom attributes to any subscribers to newsletters so that the merchant can filter on them. So we need to do this in the background, obviously, because it could be a lot of data. So we're going to use Magento's cron jobs. A little disclaimer is cron jobs, when you're working from an extension developer's point of view, are very delicate. Because if you have a long-running process that takes maybe 2 hours, that's scheduled to run every hour, it's going to bump every other scheduled task of that merchant back, and disaster happens in general, and we get a call. So we'll revisit that later. The second use case is merchants want to reward customers for subscribing to certain newsletters in MailChimp. So now the challenge is, how do we, Sweet Tooth on Magento, know about events that happen in MailChimp? Well, the good news is MailChimp also has very good webhooks. So our extension can register webhooks on MailChimp, and then all we have to do is add code that receives that webhook. So this all seems pretty simple, and you could build it with Sweet Tooth as a Magento extension. The real problems start to come when you think of how many combinations of integrations you need to do with every platform that you support and every other third-party application that we integrate with Sweet Tooth. It becomes pretty insane. Not to mention all of these platforms running different versions, so before you cut a release, you got to test all of these integrations with all these different versions, and things just explode. And to be clear, this is insane. And I can't even think about implementing that and maintaining a level of support that we're happy with. So let's talk about SAS software. So SAS software is software that runs in an environment that is controlled by the vendor. So let's see how that might look for Sweet Tooth. The first thing is we need to separate Sweet Tooth from Magento. So now we have Sweet Tooth as a SaaS product that runs at app.sweettooth.io, which is where the merchant would visit to manage anything to do with their points program. First thing to notice is SweetTooth is now running 100% on SweetTooth servers, which is an infrastructure that we control, and we can monitor it and make sure it's healthy at all times. Magento is still run on the merchant servers. Next thing we do is we add a very, very lightweight extension. And basically there's nothing much in here other than a bit of configuration logic, maybe for API keys, or handling pushing information to the SweetTooth platform. The main point is now 100% of our business logic is contained within an environment that we control, where we can add to, and where we can maintain. So how do these two systems communicate back and forth? There's two ways in general. Magento has this REST API, which we can access from app.sweettooth.io, our infrastructure there. Or our very light connector can push information if the use case presents itself to api.sweettooth.io. So we have APIs in general connecting these two systems. So already we have instant updates. Whenever we release new features to SweetTooth, all we have to do is deploy to our own system. And for a merchant to get that update, they just have to refresh the page at app.sweettooth.io, and they have all the new features and goodies that we've been working really hard on. The other thing is we can release security patches instantly. We can release stability performance increases instantly, and we have control over how that propagates to all the merchants. The other thing we avoid is environment fragmentation. SweetTooth is now running in a single environment controlled by us, and furthermore, every merchant and their experience with SweetTooth is consistent. So we've knocked off these first two major problems. Let's talk about the third one. So let's revisit SweetTooth integrating with other e-commerce platforms now. With this setup, it becomes a lot easier. We add lightweight extensions to each of these e-commerce platforms, which is generally you can do in a pretty quick amount of time. And the second thing is just adding code within the SweetTooth platform that knows how to talk to the specific APIs of the new platforms that we now support. Let's talk about SweetTooth integrating with other apps now. So how do we push points balances to MailChimp, for example? So since we now own the entire infrastructure that our app exists in, we can add queuing systems, we can add background jobs, we can schedule background jobs to run on a nightly basis to make sure the data is syncing properly between services. But most importantly, we can monitor these jobs, and in case they fail out, we can retry them, and it becomes a much safer experience for data syncs. And how do we receive subscription events from MailChimp? The same way we register webhooks, we add code in our system to receive these webhooks. So it's pretty similar to the deployed Magento extension, except here's the beauty of it. Now we can scale the number of apps we integrate with independently of the number of e-commerce platforms we integrate with. So at the bottom, we can see how scaling to different e-commerce platforms becomes very realistic. And at the top, integrating with other applications that our merchants are using also becomes more simple. But most importantly is we own the infrastructure that SweetTooth's running on, so we can update it and make sure that the product keeps evolving and continues to be a better product for merchants. Okay, so we've knocked these deployed software problems off the list. But as many of you may know, with any architecture decisions, there's always trade-offs. So let's talk about SAS trade-offs real quick. There's three big ones that you have to watch out for. The first is a decentralization of the merchant experience. So a typical Magento merchant is used to going into the Magento admin panel and managing everything to do with their entire e-commerce operations. With SAS, they have to go to app.sweettooth.io or whatever other SAS extensions they have running. And sometimes this can be a bit overwhelming and an inconsistent experience for them. The second thing is let's be clear, REST APIs are not the same as having full database access. If you need to do some multiple joins on different tables, or if you need to run some sort of analytics that crunches a lot of data, good luck doing that through the REST API. It's not going to happen. The third is DevOps, and this is an important one. Once you move to being a SaaS product, you now are responsible for the uptime, the performance, the security, and the availability of your SaaS application at all times. And this can be a learning curve for a lot of companies, but it's something that's very important to keep in mind. So what do we choose, SaaS or deployed? Well, here's the good news. It's not a binary decision. It's more of a spectrum. So you can create a fully deployed extension, like most of them out there. You can create an entirely SaaS application that only integrates with Magento through the API. Or you can land somewhere in the middle, like maybe 60% of your business logic is in the cloud, but you also have 40% of it living in a deployed extension because you need a tighter integration with that specific platform. So in general, if you need a more native user experience, full database access, or you want to make this project open source, you should lean more towards the deployed side of the spectrum. However, if you want faster product updates, lower support costs, and better integration with third-party systems, then you want to move more towards the SaaS end of the spectrum. So I want to talk real quick about the future of extensions. I think in general, this is typically how an e-commerce setup would work. You have a Magento shop or some platform, and it has a bunch of different operations and components of their e-commerce operations, all within a single monolithic environment. So we have loyalty, email marketing, shipping, support, et cetera, et cetera. I think looking to the future, we're going to see infrastructures looking more like this, where these specific components of your e-commerce operation live as independent software entities on their own clouds, maintained by companies that are passionate about doing one thing really well. And I think this is huge benefit for huge wins for everyone. For the developers, they can move faster and make their product better and spend less time maintaining deployed software. For agencies, they have a higher selection of really, really good software to choose from in order to build really great e-commerce experiences. And most importantly, the merchants. They have a wider variety of tools that they can choose from, independent of the whatever base technology they're using. And I think as there become more and more SaaS applications, this is ultimately going to end in better e-commerce applications, better e-commerce experiences, and most importantly for merchants, better e-commerce businesses. Thank you very much.